The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that blankets the streets and makes the world feel small and safe. Elijah McClain, 23, walked home from a convenience store in Aurora, Colorado. His headphones in, music filling his ears. He hummed along, swaying lightly to the beat, unaware that in just moments, his life would change forever. Elijah was tall and thin, with an easy smile and a heart that cared for everyone. He was an unassuming young man, an underdog in a world too quick to judge based on appearances. A call came into the Aurora Police Department. Someone had seen a man acting suspicious in his neighborhood. In the cold light of that evening, a complaint about a stranger walking alone seemed ordinary, trivial even. But this was the first domino in a chain of events that would unravel the life of a man who had done nothing wrong. Moments later, officers arrived, and the encounter began. Elijah raised his hands, not aggressively, not in threat, but in a gesture of peace, an instinctive response he had learned could diffuse conflict. "I'm just walking home," he said calmly, his voice soft but steady. Yet, calmness would not protect him that night. The officers interpreted his nervous energy, his height, his solitude, as suspicious behavior. In minutes, the situation escalated into a confrontation far beyond what Elijah could have imagined. What followed was a cascade of mistakes and misjudgments, magnified by authority. An officer restrained Elijah on the sidewalk. He struggled, not violently, just desperately trying to breathe as hands pressed against him. Witnesses later recounted the horror. Elijah's soft words, his polite requests to be released ignored. "I can't breathe," he said. And in a moment of tragic irony, that phrase, so often repeated in police encounters, became his last plea. The paramedics arrived, but they carried with them a chemical cocktail that would hasten Elijah's death. Ketamine. Administered ostensibly to sedate him, the dosage was dangerously high, given his body weight and condition. Elijah's health deteriorated rapidly. His life, so vibrant and gentle, slipped away while those entrusted with public safety looked on. In under an hour, a young man who was stopped for looking suspicious was pronounced dead. The emotional hook here is brutal. Elijah McClain, a musician, a volunteer, someone who brought joy to others, had been treated like a criminal. He was an underdog, underestimated by powerful figures, police officers and emergency responders, whose authority allowed them to make life-and-death decisions in an instant. Dramatic irony colors every step. The system tasked with protection became the instrument of harm. His kindness, his peaceful demeanor, meant nothing against the machinery of suspicion and control. News of his death sparked outrage, but immediate accountability was slow. The officers and paramedics involved continued their lives while Elijah's family mourned in silence, their grief amplified by the injustice of his passing. Protests began, small at first, then growing into a tidal wave. Thousands of voices demanded recognition, demanded answers, demanded justice for a man who had committed no crime. Social media became the amplifier of outrage, and the power dynamic began to shift. Authority, once unchallenged, now faced the scrutiny of a public unwilling to forget. Investigations were launched. Officers and paramedics faced inquiries, lawsuits were filed, and the story of Elijah's life and death was told across news outlets and YouTube channels, sparking conversations about systemic failures, racial profiling, and medical negligence. The underdog had become the catalyst for change, and for the first time, the powerful were forced to answer questions in public spaces they could not control. Yet, even as public awareness grew, the story remained unresolved. Accountability was partial, justice was delayed, and Elijah's absence left a void that no amount of protest could fully fill. Dramatic irony lingered. Society recognized the injustice, yet the very systems designed to protect citizens had failed him. His family, friends, and supporters had to fight not only for justice but for recognition, for the truth to be seen and acknowledged. The life lesson emerges from the tragedy. Power unchecked, when combined with bias and assumption, can destroy lives in moments. But even the smallest voice, the persistence of an underdog, can expose systemic failures and spark change. Elijah McClain's story is not just about his death. It is about the potential for accountability when the public refuses to look away, when awareness becomes action, when injustice is challenged relentlessly. The story ends on a suspenseful cliffhanger. Investigations continue, policies are debated, and the ripple effect of Elijah's death is felt in legislatures and communities across the country. Will the systems that failed him finally be held accountable? Will reforms prevent another life from being lost to suspicion, authority, and error? The fight for justice is ongoing, and the nation watches, waiting for answers that have yet to arrive. Elijah McClain may have been stopped for looking suspicious, but in his death, he became a symbol, a quiet, gentle underdog whose life illuminated the stark contrast between power and humanity, authority and kindness. And as the public continues to demand justice, the question remains: how many more lives must be threatened before the balance of power shifts permanently, and true accountability is enforced? The news of Elijah McClain's death spread like wildfire, igniting anger, confusion, and grief across Aurora and the nation. People struggled to comprehend how a young man, walking home after buying iced tea and hummus, could be treated as a threat by those sworn to protect him. His story became a mirror reflecting the deep flaws in systems meant to ensure safety, a cruel illustration of how fear and bias can override humanity. Elijah's family, devastated and enraged, refused to let his death fade into obscurity. They spoke to anyone who would listen, demanding answers, demanding accountability, demanding that the world recognize what had been taken from them. The public rallied behind them, but the fight for justice was far from simple. Power, as it often does, tried to insulate itself. The officers involved were shielded by policies and unions that protected them from immediate consequences. The paramedics were backed by protocols that excused their excessive use of ketamine. Legal loopholes, bureaucratic delays, and institutional inertia created a fortress that Elijah's family now had to storm. But the underdog had a weapon the powerful often underestimate: public attention. Social media amplified outrage. Protests filled streets, petitions circulated, and news outlets pressed relentlessly for answers. Authority that once operated without scrutiny now faced a force it could not ignore. As investigations dragged on, startling revelations emerged. Body camera footage, medical reports, and witness testimony painted a horrifying picture of overreach, negligence, and misjudgment. Each piece of evidence revealed how easily power, unchallenged, could inflict irreversible harm. Dramatic irony hung over every detail. A system built to protect life had instead ended it, and those responsible had to answer not only to the law but to the moral judgment of an entire nation. Public pressure mounted, and for the first time the balance of power began to shift. Officials could no longer sweep the incident under the rug, and the voices of citizens and activists became instruments of accountability. Protests spread beyond Aurora. Across Colorado and the United States, people marched in Elijah's memory. The chants, signs, and vigils carried a dual purpose: mourning a life lost and warning that injustice would not be tolerated. Politicians were forced to respond. Police oversight committees held emergency hearings. Policy proposals were drafted, aimed at de-escalation training, ketamine administration protocols, and racial profiling reform. The underdog, Elijah, had become the catalyst for a national reckoning. His death demanding systemic change where complacency once reigned. Yet the fight was far from over. Investigations revealed that, despite public outrage, real consequences were slow in coming. Officers and paramedics continued working while lawsuits filed by Elijah's family moved painfully through the courts. Bills proposed to reform police behavior faced political pushback, lobbying, and bureaucratic obstacles. The dramatic irony intensified. The world could see injustice clearly, yet the mechanisms designed to correct it moved at a glacial pace. The people's voice had begun to shift the balance of power, but the system still resisted full accountability. Meanwhile, Elijah's family became warriors in a battle that few had expected them to wage. They gave interviews, testified before city councils, and worked with civil rights attorneys to ensure the case could not be forgotten. Every public appearance was a reminder that the underdog, though silenced physically, could still wield influence through the determination of those who loved him. The world watched as a system resistant to change was pressured into transparency, and small victories began to emerge. Body camera policies were reviewed, emergency protocols updated, and public accountability became a requirement rather than a suggestion. Emotions ran high. Grief intertwined with hope, sorrow with resolve. The community demanded justice, but the question lingered: would justice ever truly arrive? Dramatic irony persisted in every headline, every protest, every hearing. The system that failed Elijah had to contend not only with the moral weight of its actions but with a public unwilling to forget. And yet, there was progress. The powerful now faced consequences that were previously unimaginable, and the underdog's legacy continued to grow. As the story neared its present moment, a new development emerged. State officials reopened the investigation, prompted by pressure from activists and widespread outrage. Questions about excessive force, racial bias, and medical malpractice were revisited. National organizations began to scrutinize Aurora Police Department's policies. The ripple effect of Elijah's death was now undeniable. What started as a small act of vigilance, a concerned citizen's 911 call, had escalated into a national movement questioning systemic injustice and demanding reform. And yet, the final question, the cliffhanger for Part 3, remains unresolved. Will the investigations and public pressure finally hold those responsible fully accountable? Will reforms be enacted in a way that prevents another life from being lost to suspicion, fear, and unchallenged authority? Elijah McClain may have been underestimated, dismissed, and silenced in life, but his story continues to resonate, forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths. His legacy challenges the powerful to be accountable, the system to be transparent, and the public to remain vigilant. Elijah McClain's death transformed him from an unassuming young man walking home into a symbol, a quiet, gentle underdog whose life and loss demanded justice, awareness, and change. And as the nation watches, the question remains: how far will the people push to ensure that this tragedy, and others like it, are never repeated? The fight continues, the stakes remain high, and the shadow of Elijah's story hangs over every policy debate, every courtroom, every act of authority yet to be scrutinized. Months passed since the nation first learned of Elijah McClain's tragic death, but the weight of his absence lingered everywhere. Aurora's streets were the same, but the air felt heavier, as if the city itself remembered. People whispered his name in parks and convenience stores, in classrooms and offices, carrying the story of a young man whose life had been taken for the crime of existing while black. His family refused to retreat into grief quietly. Sam McClain, his mother, spoke at rallies, on news broadcasts, and before city councils, demanding not just answers but systemic accountability. Each word she spoke was a challenge to the powerful, a refusal to allow her son's death to fade into the background. Investigations continued, but the system proved sluggish. Police officers involved in the encounter remained employed while lawsuits crawled through the courts. Medical boards reviewed the paramedics' conduct, but accountability seemed abstract, distant, delayed. Dramatic irony clung to every hearing. The public could see clearly what had gone wrong, yet the mechanisms of justice moved at their own pace. And still the underdog, Elijah, silent now, continued to influence a nation. Protesters gathered weekly, their numbers growing as more people realized that his story was not an isolated tragedy but a symptom of a system that repeatedly failed vulnerable citizens. Social media amplified the outrage. Viral clips, heartfelt tributes, and investigative journalism dissected every moment, every decision, every failure. Memes, hashtags, and online petitions created a digital pressure cooker, forcing local and national leaders to confront uncomfortable truths. What was once a local tragedy became a national reckoning. The power dynamics shifted subtly. Authority could no longer act unilaterally. Every move was scrutinized, every decision public. Citizens, once observers, became active participants in shaping accountability. The underdog had gained a voice through the persistence of a grieving family and an outraged public. Meanwhile, a critical development emerged. The state of Colorado decided to reopen the criminal investigation, prompted by the intensity of public scrutiny and independent reviews of the case. This was a rare moment where systemic inertia faltered, and the scales of authority seemed to tip slightly in favor of accountability. Lawyers and activists began uncovering records, internal memos, and procedural reports, exposing negligence and flawed judgment at multiple levels. Dramatic irony deepened. The very institutions designed to protect life were now under relentless public pressure to explain why they had failed, and the public scrutiny was unyielding. Elijah's family became symbols of perseverance and resilience. Their relentless advocacy forced conversations that officials had long avoided. City councils held special hearings on the use of chemical sedatives by paramedics, racial profiling by police, and the protocols surrounding stops based on suspicious behavior. Legislators drafted bills to prevent similar tragedies, pushing for independent oversight and mandatory transparency in law enforcement operations. Every policy change, every review, every new hearing represented a subtle but profound power shift. The people, outraged and informed, could influence systems previously untouchable. Yet even as reforms were proposed, the emotional weight remained. Public grief intertwined with hope, despair with determination. Citizens recognized the systemic failures that allowed a harmless young man to die and channeled their outrage into action. Dramatic irony persisted. While authorities debated protocols and reforms, the void left by Elijah's absence remained unfilled. His life could not be restored, but his death had become a fulcrum for change. The nation now recognized the urgency of vigilance, advocacy, and reform. Nationally, organizations dedicated to racial justice, civil rights, and police accountability began citing Elijah's case as a benchmark. Activists drew connections between his death and broader issues: bias in emergency responses, inadequate de-escalation training, and the discretionary power of authority figures. His story became part of a growing chorus demanding structural reform. Every protest, every op-ed, every policy review reminded the world that even the most seemingly powerless voices could catalyze change. Yet the story was far from over. In Aurora, tensions remained high. Families still feared the system, activists pressed for stronger reforms, and officials faced increasing public scrutiny. The cliffhanger of accountability remained. Would those responsible face real consequences, or would Elijah's story become a cautionary tale with no closure? Dramatic irony, once again, hung over every public announcement, every court filing, and every policy review. The public could see injustice clearly, but whether the system could correct itself remained uncertain. The life lesson became unmistakable. Power without accountability can destroy lives in moments, but relentless advocacy, public vigilance, and moral courage can challenge even the most entrenched institutions. Elijah McClain, underestimated in life, became an enduring symbol of resilience and moral influence in death. His story reminds viewers that injustice cannot be ignored, that the underdog can catalyze change, and that awareness without action is insufficient. The responsibility now rests with the public, to watch, to demand, and to ensure that systemic failures are not repeated. As the narration closes, the suspense remains palpable. Investigations, policy reforms, and public advocacy continue. National attention persists, and the question lingers: will full justice ever be served? Will Elijah's death prevent another young life from being judged and condemned without cause? The public remains vigilant, and the underdog, though silent, continues to shape the narrative. The final image lingers: a young man walking home peacefully, cut down for being suspicious, and a nation now awake, watching, demanding accountability. His legacy is unfinished, the story unresolved, and the fight continues. The power has shifted, but the battle remains. The nation waits, the people watch, and Elijah McClain's life, his death, his memory, his gentle presence, continues to demand justice. And as the screen fades, the haunting question remains: how long will it take before authority learns that innocence must be protected, that lives cannot be dismissed in seconds, and that even the quietest underdog can spark a revolution. Months after Elijah McClain's tragic death, the quiet streets of Aurora carried the weight of his absence like a shadow that refused to lift. Citizens, families, and activists could not forget the young man who had walked home one evening, harmless and peaceful, only to be stopped, restrained, and killed by those sworn to protect him. His story became the centerpiece of a national conversation, forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths about power, bias, and the cost of unchecked authority. The underdog, underestimated in life, was becoming a symbol of accountability and moral awakening in death. Elijah's family, carrying grief heavier than words could describe, refused to let his death fade into obscurity. Sam McClain and his relatives spoke tirelessly at vigils, on social media, in interviews, and before city councils, insisting that the system that failed Elijah be held accountable. Each public appearance was a calculated act of courage, a refusal to allow the machinery of bureaucracy to silence him. Dramatic irony underscored every moment. The system that had ended his life could now be pressured into answering for it, but the answers were slow, partial, and incomplete. Citizens began to recognize that the fight for justice would not be simple, and that the underdog's influence relied entirely on persistence, collective outrage, and moral vigilance. Investigations continued, and as footage, witness testimony, and medical reports were reviewed, the shocking extent of negligence and overreach became clear. The officer's handling of the encounter, combined with the paramedics' use of ketamine, painted a picture of systemic failure. Public outrage grew, with thousands gathering at protests, demanding accountability for decisions that should have never endangered a young man walking home peacefully. The dramatic irony was impossible to ignore. The institutions designed to protect life had become the instruments of death, yet the very people in authority were shielded from immediate consequences by policies, unions, and legal protections. The underdog's voice, however, had grown louder than ever, carried not in words but in the force of collective moral outrage. Pressure mounted on local, state, and national officials. Politicians were called to hearings, departments were forced to review policies, and advocacy groups filed lawsuits demanding transparency. Legislators debated bills addressing racial profiling, emergency response protocols, and the administration of sedatives in field situations. Every policy proposal, every public hearing, every media report became a part of Elijah's legacy, proof that even those who seemed powerless could spark change when injustice is undeniable. Dramatic irony persisted. While reforms were proposed, the system's internal inertia meant that meaningful action remained slow, leaving the public to wrestle with both hope and frustration. Public attention intensified when independent reviews revealed failures at every stage. Protocols designed to protect citizens had been ignored, misapplied, or misinterpreted. Witnesses recounted Elijah's calm demeanor, his polite pleas to be released, and his repeated assurances that he was not a threat. Each testimony deepened the moral shock. A young man, gentle and nonviolent, had been judged as dangerous within seconds, and the consequences were fatal. The underdog, who could not speak for himself, had become the catalyst for a national reckoning. Activists pointed to this as evidence that systemic bias and fear often outweigh humanity in life-or-death encounters. In Aurora, tensions between the community and law enforcement remained high. Officers faced scrutiny they had never experienced, while city officials attempted to mediate between public outrage and bureaucratic procedures. The families of other victims joined Elijah's parents in solidarity, drawing connections between his death and broader patterns of injustice. The dramatic irony was clear. Those who wielded power were forced to contend not only with legal consequences but with the collective moral judgment of an entire nation. The underdog, silenced in life, had shifted the balance of power in ways the authorities could not ignore. Meanwhile, grassroots campaigns amplified the message. Vigils, social media campaigns, and petitions highlighted every detail of Elijah's death, demanding transparency, policy reform, and accountability. The nation, once indifferent to local incidents of police misconduct, now watched Aurora closely. High-profile organizations became involved, citing the case as a benchmark for reform, using Elijah's story to press for changes in de-escalation training, emergency medical protocols, and independent oversight of law enforcement. His death had sparked a movement that transcended the city, showing that even the most underestimated voice can ignite widespread change. Yet even as reforms were debated and implemented in part, the emotional toll remained heavy. Public grief was intertwined with hope, sorrow with resolve. Families mourned their loved ones while demanding structural changes that would prevent future tragedies. Dramatic irony lingered. The nation could see the injustice clearly, yet the system still moved at its own pace. The underdog, though dead, continued to influence lives, shaping policy, inspiring advocacy, and forcing authority to acknowledge its failures. Each victory, no matter how small, carried the weight of Elijah's absence, a reminder that the cost of complacency was measured in human life. Investigations began to yield tangible outcomes. Officers faced disciplinary reviews, paramedics were questioned about procedural failures, and independent oversight committees recommended reforms. City councils voted on policy changes, including mandatory body cameras, stricter chemical restraint guidelines, and community oversight of police stops. The balance of power had shifted. The public could now demand accountability where previously there had been none. Yet the question remained: would these reforms prevent another life from being lost to bias and fear, or would systemic inertia blunt their effectiveness? As Part 4 concludes, Elijah McClain's story is both a warning and a testament. Power, left unchecked, can destroy lives in an instant, but persistence, advocacy, and moral courage can shift authority and spark reform. The underdog had become a symbol of resilience, influencing public policy, shaping discourse, and reminding the nation that justice must be pursued relentlessly. Dramatic irony remains, unresolved tension lingers, and the story leaves viewers asking, will the system truly change, or will another tragedy reveal the limits of public outrage? The fight continues, the nation watches, and Elijah's legacy demands accountability, awareness, and enduring vigilance. Elijah McClain's story, once confined to a quiet Aurora street, had grown into a national reckoning, a symbol of systemic injustice and the devastating cost of bias unchecked by accountability. By 2020, months after his death, the world had begun to pay attention in ways that could not be ignored. Protests continued, petitions multiplied, and his family refused to rest. Sam McClain, his mother, and other relatives became beacons of relentless advocacy, channeling grief into a demand for justice that reached far beyond the city limits. The underdog, silenced in life, had become a force for change in death, shaking the foundations of authority that had failed him. Investigations finally gained traction. Independent reviews concluded that the officers and paramedics involved had acted recklessly, misinterpreting behavior and overstepping protocols. Public outcry had forced authorities to reconsider what had previously been dismissed as routine procedure. Dramatic irony lingered in every revelation. A young man's kindness and innocence had been ignored while bureaucracy, policy, and unexamined authority had triumphed, yet the system now faced the consequences of its errors, compelled by the collective voice of the people. Every hearing, every report, every news story reinforced the idea that power unchecked can harm, but accountability, when demanded relentlessly, can correct. The city of Aurora began implementing meaningful reforms. Police officers underwent revised de-escalation training, protocols for the use of chemical restraints were strictly regulated, and community oversight committees were established to ensure transparency. These changes, though unable to restore Elijah's life, represented tangible shifts in the balance of power. Authority was no longer unchallengeable. The public had proven that even the most entrenched systems could be held accountable when citizens refused to remain silent. Dramatic irony persisted. What had taken the life of one young man now began to protect countless others. Meanwhile, the McClain family pursued civil lawsuits against the city, the police department, and the paramedics involved. Media coverage followed every filing, bringing national attention to the details of what had occurred. Videos of Elijah, smiling and humming, circulated alongside court documents, humanizing the man behind the headlines and galvanizing support. The underdog, underestimated in life, had become a catalyst for policy change, public scrutiny, and collective action. His story demonstrated that justice is rarely immediate, but persistence and awareness can force even the most resistant institutions to confront wrongdoing. The nation watched as public pressure intensified. Activists cited Elijah's case in broader campaigns against racial profiling, police brutality, and systemic inequities in law enforcement. Protests, vigils, and educational campaigns proliferated, highlighting both the tragedy of his death and the urgent need for structural reform. Dramatic irony permeated every discussion. The system that had failed him was simultaneously under scrutiny, forced to adapt or face growing consequences. The underdog, a gentle young man who had done nothing wrong, had become the moral compass for a nation demanding change. Accountability, though partial, began to arrive. Officers involved in the incident faced disciplinary hearings, internal investigations, and public scrutiny that challenged long-standing protections and assumptions of authority. Paramedics were reviewed for protocol violations, leading to policy revisions that restricted the use of chemical sedation in emergency situations. The city issued public statements acknowledging failures and committing to reform. The dramatic tension was palpable. The nation could see justice unfolding, but the question remained whether it would be sufficient to honor Elijah's memory. Amid the legal proceedings, emotional closure emerged for the McClain family. While no outcome could restore Elijah's life, recognition of wrongdoing and tangible reform offered a measure of solace. Public vigils continued, but they evolved into celebrations of his life, his music, his kindness, and the enduring impact he had on the world despite its attempts to silence him. Citizens understood that his death was tragic, yet his life and legacy had become a call to action, a warning that society must heed. The life lesson of Elijah McClain's story crystallized. Power without accountability is dangerous, yet collective vigilance and persistent advocacy can challenge even the most entrenched authority. The underdog, underestimated in life, had demonstrated that truth, compassion, and moral courage carry weight far beyond individual strength. His death illuminated the importance of community, of speaking out against injustice, and of holding institutions accountable for actions that affect the most vulnerable. Dramatic irony and tension remained. It took his loss to force recognition, yet that recognition now had the potential to prevent future tragedies. Even as reforms took shape, the story retained a haunting edge. National awareness remained high, but Elijah's case was a reminder that systemic injustice persists. Other incidents continued to unfold across the country, each echoing the painful lessons of bias, assumption, and unexamined authority. The fight for justice was ongoing, a constant struggle to ensure that the underdog's voice is heard, even when silenced in life. Elijah McClain's story, therefore, is both a cautionary tale and a beacon, a narrative urging vigilance, empathy, and action. The emotional climax arrived when public officials and civil rights groups recognized Elijah formally, dedicating programs and scholarships in his name. His story inspired local reforms, including community oversight committees, revised training programs, and stricter protocols regarding police encounters with civilians. The underdog's legacy had finally altered systems he could never have controlled, transforming tragedy into a tool for societal change. Dramatic irony and justice intertwined. The very power that took his life had now been constrained by the public's refusal to let it act unchecked. As the narrative draws to a close, suspense remains. While reforms have been enacted, investigations concluded, and public attention heightened, the underlying question lingers. Will society internalize these lessons, or will complacency and systemic inertia allow similar tragedies to recur? Elijah McClain, stopped for looking suspicious while walking home, may have lost his life, but his story continues to challenge authority, inspire reform, and remind the world that even the quietest underdog can ignite a movement that shifts the balance of power. The final image lingers. A young man, humming and smiling, walking home in a quiet city street, whose life, though ended too soon, sparked protests, legislative reforms, and national conversations about justice, humanity, and accountability. His memory demands that the world remains vigilant, that the innocent are protected, and that systems of power are held accountable. Elijah McClain's death was tragic, but the life he lived, the values he embodied, and the changes his absence has inspired remind us all. Justice may be delayed, power can be challenged, and even the most underestimated underdog can leave a legacy that changes a nation forever.